People are still coming in. We'll wait one more minute and we'll begin. So this is supposed to be the fun part of a... No, I'm not going to do a dance for you. It's supposed to be the fun part because you have all worked very hard all day, sometimes in back-to-back sessions. So what we wanted to do was basically have a more intellectual but also more engaged discussion that takes us away from migration for 1 minute to look at the, I won't say the bigger picture, because migration is how we got here, and in its own way, migration is the big picture. But we wanted to make this about a slightly more lighthearted discussion. Many of you have had a drink, so you can, we know that you'll be eager now to listen to 45 minutes of exciting discussion. So just for those 45 minutes, please forget about your bilaterals and stop checking Instagram. Maybe it's migration Instagram. I would understand that with the people who are here. Because I have two incredible guests with me today to have a discussion on the geopolitical challenges facing Europe. And I noticed at Ralph's session just before, geopolitics was already in the title, and in the Western Balkan session today, we also started to talk about the EU's ability to affect the world around it. The Hungarian foreign minister was saying, well, just in the Western Balkans, we have the Saudis, the Qataris, the Russians, the Turks. What is the European Union doing? There was a time when I remember Robert Cooper, who you also know, Caroline. Robert Cooper, the famous EU diplomat and intellectual who just wrote a very, very good book called The Ambassadors. Robert Cooper once said that any country that once had Roman ruins should be eligible to be a member of the European Union. And today, we are very deeply divided even over the question of the Western Balkans acceding to the EU, as has long been promised. So the question of Europe as a geopolitical actor is up in the air if we are not even sure about our attitudes towards our neighbour. Now, to discuss these issues and many more, I have two fantastic panelists. I'm very excited, actually, as they are two people that I greatly admire. The first is Caroline de Gruyter, who's a very well-known EU journalist who works for NRC Handelsblad and has also published a number of books. And it's very, very rare that you read a great, interesting book on Europe. Caroline has published many, but the latest one is This Is As Good As It Gets. I believe that is the rough rendering into English, comparing the EU and the Habsburg Empire. So we're sitting in a very historic palace, the Palais Niederösterreich, which played a major role in the revolution of 1848 and that was behind the revolution that eventually brought Prince Metternich down. So this is an ideal venue to discuss Caroline's book, which is largely based on her experiences living in Vienna from 2013 to 2017, I think, before you went to live in Oslo, and now you're back in Brussels. So Caroline has such a wonderfully, this is a very, very short snapshot of her career, because she is also a visiting fellow for the Carnegie Endowment. But I've never read anything that she has written that I haven't loved. Maybe not always 100% agreed with, but that I haven't loved. And then to the extreme left, not politically, is my friend Sébastien Lumet, who is the Brussels director, this is an important point, of the Groupe d'études Geopolitique, and also in charge of the Brussels side of Les Grands Continents, which is a fantastic website, publishing really original news stories about Europe and geopolitics. And what I really love about Sébastien and his group is that they very much, for me, represent the young Turks, if I may use that term, of European integration. Positive, confident, thinking seriously about Europe's future in the world, and not paralyzed by what I would call Euro-pessimism, because I'm really tired of Euro-pessimism. Every day we read stories, the EU is collapsing, the Euro is collapsing, Italy is collapsing, and it never happens. And there's a wonderful line in Caroline's really great book, and I will just say one or two other points and hand over to her, where she has a quote from, I think it's Prince Schwarzenberg, the Austrian foreign minister at one point, where he says, Czech, excuse me, but he came from that aristocratic family, and he says, the EU is a bit like the Habsburg Empire. Everything works quite well, but we just don't see it. So let's get into this discussion today on the basis of we have to try and understand what the EU sort of is first, and that's what Caroline's book looks at carefully. She looks at a number of very interesting parallels. So last night, Jacopo Barragazzi said the EU, to be more interesting and relevant, should move its capital from Brussels to Barcelona. And I love that, because for me, a great metaphor for the EU is the Sagrada Familia Church. To some people, it's just a badly designed church. To other people, it's beautiful. And that's exactly how I feel about the European Union. But first, I want to turn over to Caroline. Please bring us a little bit into why you decided to write a book with this parallel. Because the first thing a lot of people will say is, oh, you compared the EU and the Habsburg Empire, but the Habsburg Empire collapsed.
Well, yeah. What brought me to write it is that in 2016, when I was living in Brussels, many people were so negative or worried about the EU that they started to ask me, and 2016 was the year of Trump, the year of Brexit. Everybody thought that a pistol-carrying far-right politician would be a president of Europe. Many people assumed that early 2017 Marine Le Pen would become president of France, and Geert Wilders would also probably win the Dutch elections. So, I mean, it was a dark year. And then people asked me, do you think the EU will implode? Can it, like Habsburg did 100 years ago, almost? And I was living here, but I didn't really know the answer. I thought it's a damn good question, but I couldn't answer it because I knew nothing about the Habsburg Empire. I'm Dutch. And the Dutch focus everything on the transatlantic relations. Maybe at school I had classes on the Second World War as well. I hardly knew what Habsburg was. So I had to study it first in order to be able to answer the question. And which is easy here, of course, because it's all over the place, it's everywhere. And that's why I, in the end, started working on a book, because I discovered that we Europeans are not the only ones who always complain that the EU is too divided and too complex, too difficult to understand, and always too slow, you know, never doing the right thing, doing everything half. I mean, Habsburg was exactly the same. And if you read all the great Habsburg writers, you know, novelists, but also non-fiction writers, Karl Kraus, Stefan Zweig, Joseph Roth, all their books have been reprinted in recent years. And to us, they're almost modern books, because we understand, you know, this almost being cynical about Habsburg, because the two constructs are really very similar. They both, the EU and the Habsburg Empire, they provide a roof over the head of many nations. But in order to keep those nations in, you need to give them goodies, to give them protection, to give them social benefits, housing, a good administration, a sense of justice. The EU and the Habsburg Empire are both based on the rule of law. So the Habsburgers were always trying to keep everybody happy. And they never managed, of course, because all these nations and groups, they were always jealous of one another. They were always trying to get more out of their arrangement. So there was always negotiations going on. Then with the Croats, and when the Croats were finally more or less satisfied, the Czechs started, and when the Czechs got something, it was the Hungarians again. I mean, it's exactly like the European Union. But Habsburg lived like this. There was a Habsburg prime minister called Taaffe, around 1870, I think, who said, my job is basically about voortworstelen. You know, kicking the can down the road, muddling through. I mean, it was Jean-Claude Juncker could have said it a few years ago, because that's what we're doing. So I think often, and I explore all this in the book, but often the debate about Europe and the European Union, in my view, is too much polarized. So you have the nationalists on one side who always say Europe is too powerful, the EU is too powerful. On the other hand, you have the federalists for whom Europe is never powerful enough. It's always too weak. But if you look, I mean, I've been living in Brussels on and off for 10 years now, and writing about the EU from all kinds of places, Vienna among them. They're both wrong. They're both right, but they're also both wrong, because sometimes Europe is extremely powerful, like in the field of trade or agriculture. But on foreign policy, it's utterly powerless. So it is both, you know, it's a halfway house. And I think we expect too much of the EU. And this is why we're constantly disappointed. So what I learned from this whole exercise, which really, you know, studying Habsburg really changed the way I looked at the European Union. I think we should be a little bit more realistic. Look at the beast and ask ourselves each time in each field, how much can it deliver? Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's very little. And this is what it is. You know, it would be nice sometimes if we would have declarations after a European summit of heads of state and government. You know, 2-3 lines which everybody would be able to understand, and not this sort of langue de bois, page after page of and you know, you feel like you don't understand anything if you don't know the stories behind them. But this is how it is, and it will never change, because everybody will want to have his comma at a certain point, and a word in or a word out, and this, yeah. Otherwise, you get a European autocracy, maybe. We don't want that.
Sorry, excuse me. I just before maybe opening up with Sébastien as well, just to say I loved the fact that you mixed. It was a mixture of political analysis. Let's say the very nice historical work, although you take pains to point out that you're not an historian and you're not trying to write an official history. And you also combine it with a travelogue approach, which I really love. And then you point out that the European Union, just like the Habsburgs, closes its external borders due to a pandemic in the late 17th century. And the European Union, just like the Habsburg Empire, has to do a deal with Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, the then Ottoman Empire, in order to secure its borders, that time because of the pandemic. And it made me think, you know, today, the Union is always in crisis. In fact, since I was before puberty, I was hearing the European Union was in crisis. But it never collapses. I mean, and then your colleague and mine, Luc van Middelaar, said, that is just a bug in the system. My previous job was in the European Council with the prime ministers, and every time they would not take serious action unless a crisis was declared. And this is the reason. But to the public, it seems like the European Union is always in crisis.
Yeah.
Do you think that we can continue this way? Or we're doomed to continue this way because that's just the way the system is?
I mean, it would be very nice if it would be easier. You know, it would be very nice. I mean, we set up the euro, but we forgot mechanisms for bad weather. We set up the Schengen zone, but we forgot mechanisms for bad weather. You know, what if 1 million Syrians walk in all of a sudden? Or what if a country goes bankrupt concerning the euro? Same with banks going all over Europe, but no, we didn't need European banking supervision. Those people in Brussels, you know, they always want to tell us what to do. But, you know, so you need crisis to make leaders realize, like, okay, if we want to keep the goodies, we better take another step. And sometimes they look at, they come to Brussels, they don't want to compromise, they work up their press in their countries, and then they stand at the precipice and they see how deep it is there, and then they step back and start compromising.
Yes.
And they don't do it in one go, unfortunately. The euro is still not as solid as it should be. They took major steps thanks to the euro crisis, but I guess more steps are needed now. And COVID is another crisis that actually made Europe advance in a way. We have Eurobonds now. Okay, it's just for once, for this once. But we've done it. They were 11 times overscribed last week. It's a tremendous success. This has been the move that the whole world has been waiting for.
When you say Europe only reacts due to crises, sometimes quite impressively, as with the 2015-2016 crisis was the largest maritime crisis in history. Europe ended up saving 500,000 people's lives at sea, which is a complete historical feat. That has never been done before. But the tenor of this conversation is that, unfortunately, that it continues to exist because of a high level of political will, and it probably will continue to exist. The Habsburg Empire existed for nearly 1,000 years, and was always, well, a bit less, but I'd take 1,000 years happily. But
600.
I want to bring Sébastien in here, also take that, because it seems that the byproduct of only being able to react from a crisis is that you have almost no ability to prepare in an anticipatory way, to say, what are the likely threats in 5 years? This is where China is going to be in 5 years, based on the fact that China is now the world's largest naval power. When I read that fact the other day, I said, when did that happen? Even me, it was a surprise. So Sébastien, I wanted to just ask you, do you think that we can move away from a reactive approach to a more grand strategy approach, or is that a foolish ambition?
So thanks a lot. I mean, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I think this comparison is very interesting. You mentioned Joseph Roth in his famous book, The March of Radetzky. And it's interesting to see that in this book, there's the confrontation that all of a sudden the empire falls and nobody could expect it, nobody could see it coming. And basically, one could think that for us, the challenge is to prevent this from happening to us and to have a strategic reorientation to prevent that from happening. And I think that in this regard, an interesting way of looking at geopolitics today is to look at it through the prism of grand strategy. Because simply put, grand strategy is about looking what you can do, articulating the domestic elements of policy with the external elements of policy. And basically every major international actor does it. The US does it very clearly. As a matter of fact, grand strategy was a concept that was born in the US on the question of whether the US should be the policeman of the world or not. And you see it now very clearly with a pure focalization of external action on China as a priority, and the counterpart, the internal aspect, is a foreign policy that works for the middle class. That's the words of Biden. Obama had the concept of doing nation building at home instead of nation building abroad. So those two elements of external and internal policy are intrinsically linked in grand strategy. It's not just foreign policy, it's not just defense, it's not just diplomacy. It's economic policy, it's climate action, it's all seen with one narrative, political narrative. China does it as well. It's about guaranteeing economic prosperity to its people. It's not about values. And this is translated in their foreign policy as well, in the Chinese model, very much. And so for the EU, this brings questions. I mean, the EU is confronted to geopolitical crises that it was not created to confront, as you just said, and it's facing them in a way as it can. Whether it is Putin in Ukraine, Erdogan's cynicism during the migration crisis, Trump's brutality, all of the above. The EU is facing those crises, but passively. And so it has to better think about the external and internal articulation of its policy. It has to better think about its grand strategy. On the external aspect, we see that the EU is limited, constrained by all of the things that everybody here knows, the decision-making process, etc. But it has developed tools in the last few years that are very important and often disregarded, but I think they're important. So since 2016, it has updated its defense policy, commercial defense tools. It has established a new doctrine on China, acknowledging that it is a systemic rival. There has been the Strategic Foresight. The second edition was just published a few days ago. The Arctic Policy, Indo-Pacific Strategy, Strategic Compass is coming up. All of those elements are important external aspects, and I think they contribute to formalizing the external dimension of the EU. Now, on the internal dimension, on the internal geopolitics between nation states, member states of the EU, this is more difficult for the EU to do. And there I see, briefly put, I see two aspects. Some are positive, and I think a good example was the debate on European strategic autonomy, which has been very concretely continued with AUKUS, with Afghanistan recently. This debate was healthy, and when we hear talks that we should put an end to this debate and focus on project and on capabilities, I think this is not a right approach. It matters less what you think about European strategic autonomy than the fact that there is a debate on the continental scale on this issue, I think. And this was similar with what happened with the Eurobonds discussion, which led to Next Generation EU. It was nasty, there were fights, they were ugly, but they were healthy for the state of EU politics. And when you see the result as compared to the Euro crisis, this is a fundamental evolution, positive evolution, I would say. Now, there are some less positive aspects of this internal geopolitics. Currently, Poland is one case. We will maybe come back to this later. But those confrontations, I think, are healthy because if we can decide together the ends that we want to reach, we are better prepared to fight and to design external means to confront those together. And this is, to me, the focal point of the future of EU politics. This is going to be played in this interaction, external, internal.
So just to pin that down a bit, are you saying if we are more successful in our geopolitics, it will make it easier to be a happy EU member state if you're Poland?
All the other way around. If we better define why we are EU member states, why we are together in the EU, we may be better prepared to fight the geopolitical crises, which are going to happen regardless. So we are in a shifting world, as you said. You quoted Luc van Middelaar. He has theorized that very well, the return to history. And when we talk about a return to history, the EU, the traditional software, the intellectual software of the EU is not necessarily linked to this idea. It has to discover the language of power. Hans Kribbe talks about this very well, confronting the language of power.
Borrell also said this.
Borrell, yeah.
Has to speak.
And van der Leyen as well. It's the Geopolitical Commission. That's what is that's what she's hinting to behind, even though it's difficult to translate. And either we will face this and we will have a European way that we will design, or we will fall in one side of the other of the great confrontation that's ahead of us. And I think that if we don't define better, if we don't find a European public space or European political space, we will have a hard time defending a position that is European on the international scene.
You mentioned some internal confrontations are actually healthy for the EU, and it's true. I saw that at European Council level. We tend to call each other family, but only after we've called each other everything else, you know? Do you remember this? I can't resist to add a little side note. Do you remember this wonderful Mr. Herzog? He had a think tank in Paris called Confrontation Europe. I really liked that idea because he was predicting this phase that we're going through. Now, you said something super interesting there. You said these confrontations that are ahead of us. What confrontations are ahead of us? I mean, somebody said earlier on in one of the very good discussions that this last century was the Atlantic century. This century is the Pacific century, which means the focus of human development, this is the argument, is shifting away to the Pacific. And this is what AUKUS, this new alliance between the US, Australia, Britain, is sort of in reaction to this shift. Therefore, are we really relevant much at all? I gave you guys before the session this example of Switzerland. And the last former president of Switzerland wrote a book saying, listen, stop worrying about it. If the Europe wants to be happy, they should just be a giant Switzerland, which I take to mean rich, clever, and neutral. Do you think that that's a realistic goal for us? Starting with yourself, Caroline.
Yeah, I haven't read her book, but Switzerland, in a way, is like the EU. You know, when the EU started recognizing each other's diplomas, or member states started recognizing each other's diplomas, the Swiss had not yet done that. You know, the cantons have their own foreign policy even.
Really?
Yeah. And their own tax regimes and everything.
Well, they really are like us, then.
You cannot federalize Switzerland more than it is already, I think. I've lived there, so I studied it a little bit. But for the EU, in a way, it is the EU already, because the EU, and I come back to Habsburg, is an interstitial power. It is huge, and it is surrounded by other powers, smaller and bigger, and sometimes you can be a power while you are a group, like Islamic State, for instance. And so you never know where the next attack or the next challenge is coming from. But it's very, very difficult, and just like the Habsburgers, they never managed to make a strategy for that. Because first of all, they didn't know where it would come from. And second, with all these groups, nations and language groups, with their own histories and their own taboos and their own wish lists and hang-ups, they all had different challenges. You know, you ask Portugal now, what is your major challenge? The answer will be different from the answer you will get in Lithuania or in Greece. And this makes it extremely hard for the EU to have an active foreign policy, to have a grand strategy, let alone a grand strategy, exactly like the Habsburgers. Both are internal projects to keep the peace in the land. And Switzerland is also an internal project, you know. It is to keep the cantons all together, and they do that extremely well. But Switzerland is also embedded in the EU in a way. Huh? It is not a member state, but it is a pseudo-member state, because it copies many rules and regulations coming from Brussels. So it counts a little bit also on the protection as a very neutral country, on the protection of the wider Europe.
You made this point. Switzerland is surrounded by countries.
Yes, but by friendly countries.
So it doesn't have to worry about its security.
We have a bit of a fight now, of course, but it's a very polite fight, and it's been coming for a long way, you know. So yeah, we all saw it coming. So I think it will in the end it will be okay. But for Europe to have a big strategy, I mean, we should try by all means, and I think you have a very good point there. But so I don't see Europe doing anything in Asia. I mean, we should have our embassies there, and we have them, and we should do trade with them or on certain conditions and all that. But I think militarily we cannot do much. What we can do is defend ourselves, because for that it is much easier for a defensive war, and in a way we wage defensive wars already. You know, there's hybrid warfare going on. People, you've discussed it the whole day. People are pushing refugees into the European Union to harm us, like Turkey did a couple of years ago.
Well, this is
we can defend ourselves against that. That's easier to put all the noses in the same direction. But something more offensive, something more forward-thinking, I'm afraid it's going to be our Achilles heel always.
Well, arguably, enlargement was the EU's foreign policy, and it was an incredibly powerful one. The EU had the power of attraction. It had arguably even maybe stronger soft power than America in some ways, because America couldn't offer someone to become a state. But now enlargement is frozen. So let's go, well, I mean, it's, by the way, I'm a very strong advocate of all the Western Balkan countries becoming EU member states. But Sébastien, Caroline seems to be saying, yeah, well, we are sort of a big Switzerland and we're very unlikely to fight an offensive war. Last night, Jacopo Barragazzi gave a quite pessimistic speech about the potential to have a new EU migration policy in this legislature. But he did say, actually, there is a move coming in European integration and it's in the area of defence. So, Sébastien, can we be a big Switzerland, in your view?
So it's interesting because I think that there's one way to approach that question is regards to threats. But I think there's also a way to approach it with regards to interests, European interests. In a bloc confrontation, Europe is not Switzerland because you said, and I agree, that Switzerland has these protections that it can afford to have because of its position. But the EU is a bloc. It's the third bloc. And as a third bloc, you cannot be neutral. You have to defend interests, because if you're neutral, you will be dragged on one way or another. I think it's clear now that the EU member states, and I think let's not forget that the EU is institutions and the countries inside, so those interests are shared, whether they are military, whether they are economic, etc. So the EU will be dragged in one way or another. The EU does not want to be dragged on the recomposition of the West against China, of the alliance of democracies. I don't see that coming. I don't think that's how we would like to position ourselves. And therefore, in this regard, the EU has to guarantee and protect its interests. That may be in a shared manner with the US. It doesn't have to be confrontational on all aspects, especially on the aspects of defense. Maybe the EU should focus more on what it can do in its regional conflicts in the arc of crisis that is surrounding the EU. Maybe it can better deploy there, and maybe it should, because it's clear that the US will not step in the way it was stepping in so far. So I think that to your question on can we be a big Switzerland, not only we cannot, probably we should not, but it's also it will not happen. We will be dragged in one way or another, quite probably.
Just to pick up on what you said about the dangers of neutrality, I seem to remember in Dante's Inferno that the lowest circle of hell is reserved for those who are neutral, and I always felt that was very unfair. Is it? Surely it's okay to be...
Look, neutrality is not the highest good, of course. I mean, how can we be neutral when certain values or our good friends are attacked?
You mean the US?
No, I mean, a country is taking a big bite out of Ukraine. Are we supposed to be neutral there?
Well, this is a
I'm
question.
Sure.
No, well, inside the EU, one of the most surprising things has been the consensus on sanctions, but against Russia for its annexation of Crimea in 2014. But I do remember when I worked for Donald Tusk, and we would have these debates, they were already building about strategic autonomy, PESCO, European defence. There's been a lot of talk, there's been endless amount of talk. I remember before the Lisbon Treaty, the next big thing in Europe was supposed to be as a geopolitical player. And actually that just got put to the side. We, JHA people, we were considered nerds and very much not on the priority list of next big step in European integration. But arguably, we've moved forward in integration while the foreign policy thing has stalled a bit. Actually, we didn't want to be geostrategists, but we were being forced to be geostrategists because of the instrumentalization of refugees, which is, we're being dragged into something we never wanted. But now it's becoming clearer every day that our migration policy will not solve migration crises, because what will really solve migration crises for us is our ability to influence the world around us. What do you think about this?
I think our ability, I mean, I'm a great fan of the EU. I think we're much better off with the EU than without. But foreign policy is not our strongest point. We try to influence, we try, like the Habsburgers did, to work with buffers. We try to move very slowly, to make alliances so that we're not caught up in all kinds of difficult conflicts or even warfare. But beyond that, we have no army. I mean, look at Belarus. Look what we can do in Belarus. We all have ideas about, what we should do, but we can't, because we can't go in there. Even if we wanted to, we would not be able to. You saw it in Ukraine as well. There were lots of European politicians coming to the square in Kiev and, looking at this sea of European flags. Where do you see this? Well, now in Poland, by the way. So we gave these people hope. They rose up, and then we dropped them because we were afraid of Russia, and I think rightly so, in a way. It's a dangerous situation. So we had, our words are sometimes bigger than our actions. And so in Belarus, we don't even support those people. We're not going on the square and demonstrate with them, because we did that with Ukraine, and that was painful for them and also a bit for us. So we don't want to repeat the mistake. We don't want to give the Kremlin the idea that we are meddling in his backyard. So we just look on with our hands behind our backs. Doesn't feel good either. It's horrible. But what else can we do?
Well, if we were the Habsburgs, we would get married to somebody, because that's how the. So who can the EU get married to?
Do we have a Marie Antoinette somewhere?
Maybe there are a few characters in Brussels we could call Marie Antoinette. I don't know. But listen, indeed, I wanted to bring that up about Tusk. Tusk said, "Okay, we have a European army. What is then our decision in Donbass?" And this points to the sort of strategic paralysis that unfortunately seems to be a bug in the system. But Sébastien, can we get out of that? Is there? And of course, being a strategic player just doesn't mean just being able to fight. What I hate about the subtext of all of these conversations, is that people seem to be quietly convinced that we're moving back to global conflict.
That people are convinced of that?
They see that the globalization defined the last 30 years. We were very lucky. I grew up during globalization, and it always seemed like the world was expanding. Now it seems like the world is moving to regional blocks.
Yeah. So I think on this, it's essential to not have a binary view of either we can tomorrow be a spontaneous federation, the United States of Europe, and act geopolitically, or we are doomed to be in paralysis. I think this obviously is problematic. We see that we are definitely moving towards a regionalization of alliances. This is the case with AUKUS. This is the case also. We see it, for example, with the Franco-Greek deal to deal with Turkey. Mm-hmm. Interesting that this happens. This is an intra-EU framework that's not EU-specific, that's bilateral. So we're definitely moving towards this. We just did a publication on asking after Kabul, our transatlantic relations changed in a profound and transformative way. And I think Ben Judah had this reflection that we are moving towards a world of sub-alliances. And to a certain extent, I think AUKUS is also a manifestation of this. And this is probably true. But with regards to the tools, we have also to look at it with a cold mind, because if you look back on all of those crises that the EU has been faced with, we have dramatically improved in a lot of sense, in a lot of ways. And so the strategic capacity that we are building up, it's tough, because each time we're confronted, it's ugly. Those crises are ugly. We're panicking. We don't know how to go along with it. And I think the vaccines and the next generation EU aspect of this was interesting. The EU has gotten a lot of criticism for the way it's handled the crisis, and at the beginning we were slower, etc. But in the end, we have not done so bad. We have not lost cohesion so much faced with the vaccine diplomacy of China and with the America First of the US. And we end up being in a position today where we're not so bad. And looking back, the common procurement seems obvious, but it was not at all. And yet the officials have managed to do it. And so I think that block by block, those elements are putting one block on top of another progressively, and this is positive. Now the problem is, if we cannot have a systemic approach to this, a more systemic approach to this, we will keep discovering new points of vulnerabilities with each crisis. And that to me is more the challenge rather than just having a solution, a ready-made solution tomorrow for a spontaneous evolution of institutional evolution in the EU. And by the way, for this aspect, I think think tanks, journals have a very important role because they are about translating, they're about confronting ideas, European ideas, so with one another. And the fact that there's increasingly translation work from Polish authors who are being read in French in France and German who are being read in Greece. This is very important, and this is constitutive of a sort of political space, EU political space, political sphere that is progressively sedimenting. And that's as important as the policy aspect, I think. It feeds, again, to come back to the external, internal, this way it's like, it feeds into one another, the politics and the policy of that.
Very interesting. Our friend and colleague, the Turkish ambassador, would like to react. If we can please get a microphone. Also have to keep an eye on time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to both panelists. I am not one of the young Turks of Brussels anymore, but I am the old Turk of Vienna now. I will of course respect the intellectual nature of this discussion, but I cannot accept the name of my president be mentioned together with brutality, brutalizing people or whatsoever. I have to tell this. This is my duty, and this is not true. Brutality means lots of things. I mean, I think that it is unfair to a president which have been doing a lot for Europe and still in charge of a country hosting 4 million Syrians, which would be or which could be in Europe, at least half of them today. I find it a little bit unfair. This is my intellectual and official words. For Madam, perhaps I couldn't understand well, but there is nothing wrong in what Turkey is doing with Hamas. Hamas is elected by some part of the Palestinian people. So by excluding Hamas from any kind of equation, the EU or some EU member states are excluding themselves from being involved and from helping to the solution of the problem between Israel and Palestine. My question, which is important, and of course I have to regret this bilateral agreement between France and Greece. Both countries have told us that there is nothing against Turkey on it, but here we are all NATO members, and Atlantic Alliance exists, and we have mutual defense commitments. My question, sorry for being a little bit longish, I had to go to record for that. The problem, distinguished speakers as well, I've heard today that in the Western Balkans there was a kind of vacuum. China, Russia, Turkey, I don't know, some other countries were mentioned, they can come in to fill the vacuum. The point, I mean, Turkey is a candidate country negotiating with the EU. We have some problems today, but tomorrow things will change, and this is still our strategic perspective to become member of the European Union. Frankly speaking, personally, I cannot accept Turkey being treated or discussed together with Russia and China and other countries in this context. But the real problem, and this is my question to you, don't you think it is a little bit dangerous to put Turkey, which is a member of NATO alliance, together with all the members, all the countries of the Balkans? I mean, you call it Western Balkans. Don't you think that this is a little bit undermining the cohesion and solidarity of the eastern part and southeastern part of NATO? Thank you. Sorry for being long.
We're getting a little pressed for time, so we have to be brief. So we just react very briefly, and then we finish.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for your reaction. I can't remember having mentioned Hamas, but as a... Okay.
She didn't mention Hamas.
But as a former resident of the Gaza Strip, I totally agree with you. Okay.
Yes, okay.
Okay. But more in general, I think the EU needs to rethink the way it does business with third countries. There are all kinds of programs that are not really working well at the moment. The balance of power is changing around Europe as well. We were surrounded, Carl Bildt once said this, I believe, used to be surrounded by a ring of friends, and now it's a ring of fire. A lot of our relationship with third countries around Europe are influenced by geopolitics at the moment. And that includes your country as well. So I think we need a reset, and we need a reset based on new relations. And that means not putting any country in the same bag as others.
Sébastien, briefly, if you can, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your comments. So I was talking about Trump's brutality, so it was not Turkey's brutality, it was Trump's brutality. Sorry, sorry, but it's. I mean, of course, I've talked about Turkey. I was using rather the migration policy, and we don't have time to get into detail, just to use that as a typical dual issue that I was talking about at the beginning of the discussion, where internal division gives leverage to third parties with regards to the EU. That's in this sense that I was talking about this. And the internal lack of cohesion of the EU basically jeopardizes its capacity to confront an external crisis, such as the migration crisis. And 2015 is a good illustration of that, because the option of Turkey was, the deal was, that's how it is, it worked, that's how it was. It's probably not the ideal work, but confronted with a spontaneous crisis, that's how the EU has confronted it. And I will not make judgments on this matter. But I was just using this example to show that, for example, in the context of the current context of with regards to the rule of law in Poland, we have to end here, but just very briefly, the current debate and what's currently going on is weakening the EU in its capacity to uphold the rule of law and democracy abroad. And this is another debate, but those are internal divisions give way to external pressures where we are not masters of ourselves anymore. And we have to.
There's only one rule in geopolitics you need to remember: weakness repels and strength attracts. And for my part, Mr. Ambassador, I only refer to Turkey in that sense, of course, as an EU member, but also as undoubtedly a major strategic player. And there's certainly no need to apologize for that. We have kept you too long. I'm really impressed, actually, with the wonderful, I can feel the listening in the room, so thank you very much. Now, we keep you from your reception, so please, there's now a lovely reception which you have more than earned, and you need to head towards the staircase in order to get there. So thank you so much to our panelists and to you. Good.